Hello and welcome. Tonight we're traveling back to a city once torn in two, where concrete and barbed wire split not just a place, but a people, a nation, and an entire era. This is the story of the Berlin Wall, how it rose, why it stood, and what it meant to those trapped in its shadow. From the last days of World War II to the electric night it crumbled, we'll drift through decades of tension, escape, and resilience, and meet the voices who lived on either side of history. So, if you're ready to unwind, settle in, and let your mind wander through the echoes of the Cold War, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications, so you never miss another peaceful journey through the past. Now, let's begin. Chapter 1. A City Divided. The Origins of Post-War Berlin. The guns fell silent in Europe on May 8, 1945. After 6 long years of devastation, bloodshed, and unimaginable destruction, World War II had come to an end. But peace, as history so often teaches us, does not arrive without consequence. And in the aftermath of one of humanity's darkest chapters, new lines were drawn, not just on maps, but in minds, ideologies, and hearts. Germany lay in ruins. Its cities were rubble, its people displaced, its government dismantled. And at the heart of this fractured nation stood Berlin, the once grand capital now a hollow shell of its former self. Buildings scorched and collapsed, streets eerily quiet, the air still heavy with the smoke of a war that had barely passed. But even as the last echoes of war faded, a new battle had already begun. One not fought with tanks and rifles, but with influence and fear. A war of ideas, values, and control. A Cold War. As Allied forces, American, British, French, and Soviet, moved into Berlin, they brought not just supplies and relief, but blueprints for what came next. Germany, they had agreed, would be divided into 4 occupation zones, one for each major power. Berlin, though located entirely within the Soviet-controlled eastern part of the country, would also be split into 4 sectors. A city within a city, a shared responsibility, or so it was imagined. At first, this uneasy arrangement seemed functional. The victors, despite their deep differences, had stood together to defeat the Nazi regime. For a moment, there was a flicker of cooperation, a fragile alliance. But beneath the surface, tensions simmered. The Soviet Union, under Joseph Stalin, had its own vision for post-war Europe, one where socialist ideology would spread and solidify. In contrast, the Western Allies were committed to rebuilding Germany as a democratic, capitalist nation. These conflicting goals would soon make Berlin the central stage of a global rivalry. By 1946, relations among the former Allies had cooled dramatically. Trust dissolved. Communication faltered. And Berlin, that devastated, divided city, became the symbol of a much deeper fracture, the ideological chasm between East and West. In the Western zones, the United States and its partners worked quickly to stabilize the economy, rebuild infrastructure, and prepare for a democratic government. In the East, the Soviet Union pursued a different path, installing sympathetic political leaders, restructuring the economy along communist lines, and ensuring loyalty through surveillance and control. The contrast was striking. To the west, shops reopened, newspapers printed freely, and whispers of recovery spread. To the east, rationing continued, censorship grew, and a sense of surveillance lingered in the air. The people of Berlin, neighbors separated only by a street or a bridge, began living in two very different worlds. And then, in June 1948, the first major crisis of the Cold War erupted. Stalin, angry at the introduction of a new currency in the Western zones and suspicious of Western intentions, ordered a blockade. All road, rail, and canal access to West Berlin was cut off. The city, surrounded by Soviet-controlled territory, was effectively trapped. 2 million people were left without access to food, fuel, or medicine. It was a bold move, an attempt to force the Western Allies out of Berlin, to claim the entire city for the East. But the response that followed was even more audacious. And it came not with confrontation, but coordination. The Berlin airlift. Within days, American and British planes began flying supplies into West Berlin. Every few minutes, around the clock, aircraft landed at Tempelhof Airport. Flour, coal, milk, medicine, day after day, week after week, through storms, shortages, and danger. Children watched from rooftops as candy parachutes fell from the sky. The people of West Berlin, isolated yet not alone, survived. The blockade, after 11 tense months, was lifted. Stalin had failed to drive the Allies out, but though the blockade ended, the division deepened. In 1949, two separate German states were established. In the West, the Federal Republic of Germany, democratic, capitalist, and aligned with the West. In the East, the German Democratic Republic, a socialist state under Soviet influence. Berlin, though entirely within East Germany, remained split. West Berlin, a capitalist enclave surrounded on all sides, a flickering light in the heart of the Soviet bloc. It was an anomaly and a growing problem for the East German government. Because as the 1950s unfolded, something began to happen. People left, not in protest or defiance, but quietly, in growing numbers. Doctors, engineers, teachers, laborers. Thousands of East Germans crossed into West Berlin each month, and from there they boarded trains and planes, heading to new lives in the West. They were voting with their feet, fleeing surveillance, censorship, and scarcity for opportunity and freedom. By the end of the decade, over 2 million East Germans had made the journey. It was, for the East German regime, an existential crisis, a hemorrhage. And despite efforts to tighten controls, increase propaganda, and threaten defectors, the exodus continued. The city was still open, at least for a little while longer. By the early 1960s, the pressure reached a breaking point. Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet premier, demanded that the status of Berlin be resolved. He threatened to sign a separate peace treaty with East Germany, effectively cutting off Western access. The West, led by President John F. Kennedy, refused to back down. Berlin was more than a city now. It was a symbol of freedom, of defiance, of division. And then, in the dark of night, it happened. On August the 13th, 1961, East German soldiers and workers began sealing off the border between East and West Berlin. Streets were blocked. Barbed wire rolled out. Families were separated in an instant. By morning, the wall had begun. It was not yet the concrete monolith it would become, but the message was clear. The border was closed. The Berlin Wall had risen. Chapter 2: Iron Curtains and Concrete Barriers. The wall rises. It began with barbed wire, simple, makeshift, and almost surreal. In the early hours of August 13th, 1961, East German soldiers fanned out across the border of East and West Berlin. They carried rolls of fencing, tools, rifles. Trucks arrived with posts and wire, and workers quickly set to task. Streets were blocked, tracks were torn up, sidewalks were split in two. By dawn, Berlin was no longer a city with a porous border. It was a city divided. Those who woke up that Sunday morning in the West looked out across familiar roads, only to see barriers where there had been sidewalks. Friends, lovers, co-workers, now unreachable, just a few feet away, but sealed off by soldiers. Confusion spread. Rumors ran wild. Was it temporary? A drill? A provocation? But as the hours passed and the wire turned to brick, reality set in.
The Berlin Wall was not a bluff. It was a border.
The East German government, the GDR, called it an anti-fascist protection rampart. They claimed it was built to prevent Western spies and provocateurs from destabilizing the socialist state. But everyone, both in Berlin and around the world, knew the real reason. It was to stop the flow of people. The hemorrhaging had to end. The wall was a tourniquet. At first it seemed slapdash, barricades made of concrete blocks, streets torn open. But quickly, the construction became more organized and more permanent. Within weeks, cement slabs were erected. Watchtowers appeared. Armed guards patrolled the perimeter. By the end of 1961, a grim reality had taken shape. The wall was no longer a symbol. It was a structure. It stretched for nearly 100 miles around West Berlin, along the city streets, through neighborhoods, past rivers, canals, and farmland. Its path was not neat. It sliced through cemeteries, cut off roads, and even severed buildings in half. In some cases, families living in the same apartment building found themselves on opposite sides of a deadly border. And it wasn't just the wall itself. The border was layered, a death strip designed to stop, trap, and kill anyone who tried to flee. First came the inner wall, facing East Berlin, then a patrol road, minefields, floodlights, sand strips to reveal footprints, guard dogs, machine gun nests, and finally, the outer wall, facing West Berlin. A no man's land in the heart of a city. But for all its brutality, the wall was also oddly quiet. There were no sirens, no confrontations, no storming of borders or public trials, just silence, cold, grey silence. And in that silence, something settled across the city. A numbness, a resignation. Berliners adapted. They had to. West Berlin became an island, dependent on air and road corridors for supplies. Its economy shifted. Its skyline began to reflect its isolation, modern, bold, yet surrounded. The US maintained a military presence, as did the British and French. Checkpoints were established, the most famous being Checkpoint Charlie. There, tanks faced each other. Flags waved in defiance, and the world held its breath. Because Berlin, now split by stone, was also the fault line of the Cold War. A mistake here, a miscommunication, a spark, and nuclear war could follow. The East German regime, under Walter Ulbricht, reinforced its power. The wall gave them control. With the border sealed, the state intensified its grip on daily life. The Stasi, the Ministry for State Security, expanded. Neighbors were encouraged to inform on one another. Surveillance was omnipresent. Phones were tapped, letters intercepted. Trust became a scarce commodity. Yet for all the repression, people still dreamed, and some dared to act. Escape attempts began almost immediately. Some dug tunnels under buildings. Others jumped from apartment windows before they were bricked up. There were daring flights in homemade hot air balloons, secret compartments in cars, divers swimming across canals in the dead of night. Many failed. Between 1961 and 1989, at least 140 people died trying to cross the Berlin Wall. Some were shot by border guards. Others drowned, electrocuted, or were crushed in failed attempts. Their stories, often silenced at the time, became symbols of both tragedy and courage. Peter Fechter was 18 years old. In August 1962, 1 year after the wall was built, he tried to escape with a friend. They made it to the base of the wall. His friend scaled it and made it across. But Peter was shot in the back. He fell into the death strip, crying for help, bleeding as East German guards stood by. Western soldiers watched helplessly, unable to cross the border. For nearly an hour, Peter lay there, dying in front of the world. He became a martyr, a reminder that this was not just a wall of ideology, but one of pain. Over the years, the wall evolved. It was rebuilt several times, each version more fortified than the last. The final iteration, known as Grenzmauer 75, stood 12 feet high, smooth concrete topped with a rounded pipe to make it harder to climb. It was a fortress. But even fortresses wear down, not from impact, but from time. And as the decades passed, cracks began to appear, not in the concrete, but in the system that built it. In the East, discontent grew. Economically, the GDR lagged behind the West. Shops were sparse. Travel was restricted. Propaganda rang hollow. Young people questioned. Intellectuals debated. Underground music, literature, and resistance networks began to stir. And outside of Germany, the world was changing. The Soviet Union was no longer the same force it had been in the 1950s. New leadership would emerge, and with it, a different future for the Eastern Bloc. But in 1961, none of that was clear. For now, Berlin was broken, and the wall, cold, quiet, and unmoving, stood as a monument to division. A grim reminder that even in times of peace, walls can rise not just to protect, but to imprison. Chapter 3. Life in the Shadow of the Wall. East versus West Berlin. The wall didn't just split a city, it split a culture, a rhythm, a way of living, and most hauntingly, it split people from themselves, from their memories, from their hopes, and from their sense of what was possible. On the map, Berlin was still one place, but in every other way, it had become two distinct worlds, separated by ideology, circumstance, and an ever-thickening silence. In West Berlin, life carried on under the gaze of democracy, capitalism, and Western influence. It was surrounded, completely encircled, by East Germany, yet it remained open. Flights came and went. Goods arrived by truck, rail, and air. The city received financial support from the Federal Republic of Germany, West Germany, and from the United States. It became, in many ways, a Western showcase. Skyscrapers rose, cafes reopened, music played on transistor radios, theaters, bookstores, art galleries. They thrived, not just as cultural institutions, but as acts of resistance. West Berlin became a magnet for the young and the restless, especially those avoiding military conscription, which didn't apply in the island city. Students filled the universities, philosophers filled the airwaves, activists filled the streets. Yet, for all its vibrancy, West Berlin carried a certain heaviness. It was a city under constant pressure. US tanks patrolled the periphery, armed guards watched over the border, sirens occasionally wailed in the night. The wall wasn't just a distant thing, it was ever present. A looming backdrop. You could see it from your kitchen window, or hear it in the sudden quiet of a conversation. Children grew up playing in the shadows of guard towers. Teenagers dared each other to climb too close. Adults found themselves pausing mid-sentence, glancing over their shoulder, wondering, always wondering, what life was like just a few meters away. For those in the East, the answer was more complex. Life in East Berlin, the capital of the German Democratic Republic, was not defined by chaos or lawlessness. On the contrary, it was defined by order, structure, regulation, a clean grey grid of expectations. People had jobs, they had homes, they had schools and hospitals, public transport, and a calendar of holidays celebrating workers, revolutionaries, and the virtues of the collective. But they did not have freedom, or more precisely, they had a version of it scripted by the state. You could read the news, but only what the party approved. You could travel, but only within the bloc. You could express yourself, so long as it aligned with socialist values. The Stasi, the secret police, were not a myth whispered about in alleys. They were a living presence. One of the most effective and oppressive intelligence agencies in history, the Stasi maintained detailed files on millions of citizens. They recruited informants, neighbors, co-workers, even family members. Your barber might be on their payroll, so might your cousin. And yet, daily life in East Berlin was not entirely joyless. There were moments of warmth, tradition, and connection. Families gathered for meals, children played in the streets. Artists found subtle ways to express themselves through metaphors and abstraction. People fell in love, raised children, and learned to navigate the invisible boundaries imposed upon them. Still, the comparison was impossible to ignore. From the TV towers of East Berlin, you could sometimes pick up Western signals. On certain nights, people would huddle around their televisions and catch glimpses of shows, commercials, and music from the West. A car commercial, a pop song, a Hollywood film trailer, just enough to stir longing and doubt. That's when the wall felt tallest. When you realize that across a single concrete line, your future might have unfolded differently, not necessarily easier, but freer. Some adapted, some complied, others resisted, quietly, cleverly, dangerously. There were underground writers, smuggling out manuscripts, clergy who preached justice beneath layers of state-friendly language, teachers who subtly questioned official textbooks. And there were artists, sculptors, filmmakers, playwrights, who found ways to speak between the lines. But there was also exhaustion, the daily effort of pretending, of watching your words, of explaining to your children why they couldn't visit their aunt, even though she lived just 10 blocks away, on the other side. West Berlin, meanwhile, cultivated a culture of defiance, not the loud, brash kind, but a kind of creative resistance. The city became a canvas. Graffiti bloomed across the wall's western face. Artists from all over the world came to leave their mark. Abstract murals, political slogans, messages in dozens of languages. The wall, grim and brutal from the east, became, on its western side, a chaotic gallery of protest and hope. David Bowie lived in West Berlin for a time. So did Iggy Pop. Musicians, filmmakers and writers gravitated toward the city not despite its tension, but because of it. The edge of a divided world had become a space of strange freedom. And yet, the wall still cast a shadow. It divided families, lovers, childhood friends. For many Berliners, especially older generations, this division was a wound that never fully healed. Birthdays passed without hugs, weddings happened with empty chairs, funerals were missed. Grandparents met their grandchildren only in photographs, if at all. To cross the wall legally, you needed permission, and permission was rarely granted. A sick parent, a dying relative, even those were not always enough. And for East Germans, applying for a travel permit could itself draw suspicion. Why would you want to leave? West Berliners, for their part, could visit the East through controlled checkpoints. But even then, their movements were tracked, their currency restricted, and their presence often discouraged. Still, life found a way. Across the divide, some families maintained connections. Letters, carefully written, cautiously worded, were exchanged. Holiday cards, birthday gifts, sent across a border that felt more like an ocean. Children on school trips to Berlin were brought to the wall, where teachers explained the history, pointing out the no man's land, the floodlights, the armed guards. Parents warned their kids never to run, never to shout, never to gesture too wildly toward the east. Always the fear that someone might misunderstand. But for all its sharpness, the wall also became mundane, routine. People walked past it on their way to work. Street musicians played near it. Tourists took photos. Couples met under its shadow. It became, in its own bleak way, part of the architecture of daily life. A monument not to war, but to its aftershocks, to what happens when a conflict ends on paper, but not in people's minds. And yet, through all of this, the silence, the separation, the slow grind of controlled lives, something endured, a whisper, a question, a hope. What if the wall could fall? Chapter 4: Escape and Resistance. Stories of courage and defiance. For as long as the Berlin Wall stood, people tried to get over it, or under it, around it, through it. It didn't matter how tall the concrete stretched or how many guards patrolled its deadly perimeter. The human spirit, when pressed against confinement, finds cracks. It listens for the hollow sounds behind walls. It watches for blind spots, and when the moment is right, it runs. Escape from East Berlin was never easy. The wall was engineered not just to discourage, but to destroy. Anyone caught attempting to cross risked everything, not just their lives, but the safety of their families. The East German government considered escape a criminal offense, and punishments were swift and severe. Prison, exile, surveillance, social erasure. Yet people still tried. Some tried within days of the wall's construction. They jumped from windows before they were sealed, ran across still open streets, crawled through sewers, swam across canals under cover of night. Many of these early attempts were successful, but as the wall evolved, so did its defenses. It became a fortress. An escape became an art form. One of the most audacious escapes happened in October 1964. Two families, the Strelzics and the Wetzels, constructed a homemade hot air balloon. Over the course of 18 months, they gathered fabric, stitched it by hand, and built a makeshift burner from propane tanks. On a cold, moonless night, they took off from a field near the border. The balloon soared silently across the death strip. As they descended, alarms triggered and guards scrambled. But it was too late. They landed safely in the west. 8 people, free. There were also tunnels. Between 1961 and 1982, at least 70 tunnels were dug under the wall. Most were small, narrow, damp, just wide enough for a crawling body. One of the most famous, known as Tunnel 57, helped 57 people escape in October 1964. It was dug by West Berlin students, working in secret, hauling dirt by hand, night after night. When the time came, escapees crawled through the tunnel into the basement of a bakery in the west. It was tight, terrifying, and triumphant. But not all stories ended in celebration. Many escape attempts failed. Some were betrayed, others mistimed. A missed step, a flashlight beam, a soldier who aimed instead of hesitated. People died. Peter Fechter, Chris Gueffroy, Gunther Litvin. Their names, etched into memory, and in some cases, literally carved into the wall. Fechter was shot in 1962, just 18 years old. He bled to death in full view of Western cameras. Too close for help, too far for rescue. His death sparked outrage and protests, but the wall did not move. Others paid the price differently. Those caught were interrogated, imprisoned, sometimes tortured. Families were harassed, children lost access to schools, careers were destroyed. In a system built on control, defiance came with a heavy cost. Yet resistance persisted, not just in escape, but in presence. In the 1970s and 80s, East Germany saw a quiet rise in civil resistance. Church groups began holding peace prayers. Artists organized underground exhibitions. Punk bands played band music in basements and garages. These were not acts of revolution, not in the traditional sense. They were acts of refusal, to comply, to conform, to stay silent. The Protestant Church, in particular, became a sanctuary, not immune from surveillance, but slightly more protected. It hosted discussions, art, music. In these modest spaces, people began to imagine something different, something more. Samizdat, the underground publication of censored material, spread among intellectuals, illegal broadcasts, graffiti on back walls, jokes whispered at the dinner table, each one a crack in the facade of absolute control. And cracks spread. The Stasi, for all its power, could not silence dreams. It could intimidate, isolate, and disrupt. But it could not erase the human desire for freedom, for movement, for dignity. And as the 1980s arrived, pressure built from within and beyond. Václav Havel in Czechoslovakia, Solidarity in Poland, Perestroika and Glasnost in the Soviet Union. A slow unraveling began. In East Germany, the pressure was subtler at first. A protest here, a letter there, but the whispers were growing louder. Something was changing. And somewhere in the minds of those who had long watched the wall, a question returned, now louder, now sharper, now more real. What if the wall could fall? Chapter 5. The Global Cold War. Tensions beyond the wall. The Berlin Wall was never just about Berlin. It was a front line, a sharp, silent scar across the city's face. But its roots reached far deeper. To understand the wall, to truly feel its cold concrete weight, you must look beyond it. Beyond Brandenburg Gate, beyond the watchtowers, beyond the border. Because this was never just about Germany. This was about the world, the Cold War. That long, frozen standoff between East and West, stretched from the bombed-out buildings of post-war Europe to the rice paddies of Vietnam, the deserts of the Middle East, and the jungles of Latin America. And at its heart lay a single, terrifying question. Whose vision of the future would win? The United States and its allies envisioned a world bound by markets, democracy, and individual liberty. The Soviet Union, under the hammer and sickle, envisioned a world of collective ownership, centralized power, and revolutionary solidarity. Each saw themselves not only as right, but as righteous. And so the world split into alliances, into blocks, into ideologies as incompatible as oil and water. In 1949, the Western powers formed NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, a military alliance committed to defending against any Soviet aggression. In response, the Soviet Union and its Eastern European satellite states formed the Warsaw Pact in 1955. With Germany and Berlin caught between them, Tensions played out in speeches and summits, in embassies and espionage, in proxy wars, space races, and arms build-ups, always under the threat, real or imagined, of nuclear annihilation. The Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 brought the world closer to that edge than ever before. For 13 days, the US and the Soviet Union stood on the brink, over missiles in Cuba, over pride, over fear. It was a game of nerves with humanity as the stakes. In Berlin, US troops went on high alert, Soviet forces readied for conflict, and all along the wall, the tension was electric. But the missiles were withdrawn. War, at least on that day, was avoided. Still, the race continued to influence, to outpace, to dominate the narrative of what freedom meant and what danger looked like. In Vietnam, the United States poured in troops, helicopters, and bombs in an effort to halt the spread of communism. In Afghanistan, the Soviet Union would do the same in reverse, fighting a grueling war against mujahideen fighters supported by Western intelligence agencies. In Latin America, coups and counter-coups were orchestrated in the shadows. In Africa, newly independent nations found themselves courted, pressured, and sometimes manipulated by both superpowers. Everywhere, the Cold War left its fingerprint, and in the middle of it all, the Berlin Wall stood like punctuation, a symbol, a warning, a monument to division. But symbols are powerful, and both sides knew it. In 1963, President John F. Kennedy visited West Berlin and gave a speech that echoed across the globe. Standing near the wall, with thousands gathered before him, he declared, "Ich bin ein Berliner." I am a Berliner. The phrase was more than political theatre. It was a declaration of solidarity, a message to the world that West Berlin, isolated and encircled, would not be abandoned, and neither would the idea of freedom. On the other side of the wall, such speeches were banned. Western broadcasts were jammed, satellite dishes outlawed. But signals still got through. Words filtered into East Berlin like fog, shaping thoughts, challenging certainty. And inside the East, cracks began to spread, not just in ideology, but in faith. By the late 1970s and into the 1980s, the Soviet economy was stagnating. The Eastern Bloc struggled to keep up with the technological and economic momentum of the West. Living standards diverged more visibly. The promise of socialism, once inspiring to many, began to feel hollow. Meanwhile, Western Europe was evolving. Economies grew, cultures shifted, technology advanced, and television, even glimpsed through static or whispered second-hand, revealed a lifestyle that felt worlds apart. West Germany boomed, rebuilt by the Marshall Plan and powered by capitalism. East Germany, by comparison, tightened control. Its government maintained order with propaganda and fear, but even fear has its limits. Then, in 1985, a new leader took power in the Soviet Union. Mikhail Gorbachev. He brought with him two new words, glasnost and perestroika, openness, restructuring. It was a break from the past, a signal that even the mighty USSR was ready to change, to loosen its grip, at least slightly. Reforms were slow, inconsistent, and not universally welcomed. but they opened a door that had been closed for decades. In Eastern Europe, people began to push harder. In Poland, the solidarity movement grew stronger. In Hungary and Czechoslovakia, reformers gained traction. Protests increased. Dissidents spoke louder. And all the while, the wall loomed over Berlin, silent, unbending, but no longer unquestioned. Western leaders came year after year, standing near its base, promising that it would fall. Perhaps most famously, in 1987, President Ronald Reagan stood before the Brandenburg Gate and said, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." It was part theatre, part diplomacy, but more than anything, it was prophecy. Because while the wall still stood, history had begun to shift. And behind the Iron Curtain, people were listening. Chapter 6. Winds of Change. Gorbachev and the Eastern Bloc awakens. It began, as great changes often do, with a whisper. A whisper that became a murmur that grew into a rumble, and a rumble that would, within a few short years, shake the foundations of an entire geopolitical order, toppling walls, regimes, and illusions. The 1980s dawned with uncertainty. The Cold War had not thawed. In fact, in many ways, it had stiffened. The Soviet Union, once a titan of revolutionary fervor, was now a wounded giant, bloated by bureaucracy, weighed down by inefficiency, and drifting under the inertia of its own system. Its people were not starving, but they were not thriving. Shops were stocked with slogans, but short on goods. Factories produced weapons and tractors, but few innovations. Newspapers praised 5-year plans while ignoring the long lines for bread. And in the republics and satellite states, those nations of the Eastern Bloc tethered tightly to Moscow, the winds of change had begun to stir. In Poland, workers had already begun to push back. In 1980, a spark was lit in the Gdansk shipyard, where an electrician named Lech Wałęsa led a strike that captured the imagination of millions. From that spark came solidarity, not just a labor movement, but a peaceful revolution. For the first time in the Soviet sphere, a mass movement had formed outside the control of the Communist Party. It was organized, it was popular, and it was resilient. Though suppressed for a time, solidarity never truly disappeared. Its very survival in even underground Fush proved that the system could be challenged. And then came 1985. Mikhail Gorbachev rose to power in the Soviet Union. Young by Soviet standards, thoughtful, ambitious. He was not a dissident. He believed in socialism, but he believed it needed air, light, reform. And so, 2 words echoed across the USSR, perestroika and glasnost. Perestroika, a restructuring of the economy, an attempt to loosen the rigid state control, encourage limited private enterprise, and invite innovation. Glasnost, openness, a policy that permitted more freedom of expression, more transparency in government, and a tentative end to the crushing censorship that had silenced so many for so long. At first, the changes felt subtle. A slightly freer press, fewer arrests for political jokes, new faces in leadership. But over time, the effects deepened. Soviet citizens began to read about the atrocities of the Stalin era in official newspapers. Television programs debated policy. Films that had long been banned suddenly aired nationwide. History, long controlled and curated, began to emerge in fuller, messier, more human forms. And while these changes rippled across the Soviet Union, the satellites began to quake. The Eastern Bloc, Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, Bulgaria, Romania, had long been held together not just by ideology, but by the implicit threat of Soviet force. The memory of 1956 in Hungary and 1968 in Prague was etched deep. When reform went too far, tanks followed. But under Gorbachev, that threat began to fade. In 1989, the unthinkable happened. Poland held semi-free elections, and Solidarity won a landslide. A non-communist prime minister took office. The change was peaceful. No tanks, no crackdown, and the world held its breath. In Hungary, the border with Austria, the Iron Curtain's physical western edge, was slowly dismantled. Barbed wire was cut, mines removed. And in May 1989, Hungarian officials announced the opening of the border. East Germans heard the news. Some packed bags, quietly, cautiously, and made their way to Hungary, then to Austria, then to West Germany. They had not crossed the Berlin Wall, but they had escaped the East, and word spread. By summer, thousands of East Germans were leaving through Hungary. Camps overflowed, embassies filled with desperate families. The GDR, East Germany, called it illegal emigration, a betrayal. But the tide could not be stopped. Protests erupted in Leipzig, peaceful, organized. Tens of thousands marched each Monday, chanting for reform, for freedom, for change. Wir sind das Volk, they cried. We are the people. The Stasi watched, photographed, recorded. But they didn't arrest. They didn't attack. Not yet. By October, the protests had swelled. Hundreds of thousands took to the streets across East Germany, not for violence, not for destruction, but for dignity. And in that moment, the regime blinked. Erich Honecker, the hardline East German leader, resigned. He was replaced by Egon Krenz, who promised reform. But it was too late. In Leipzig, in Dresden, in East Berlin, the crowds grew. The fear receded. A threshold had been crossed. The people had realized something precious and dangerous. That they outnumbered their oppressors. That together, peacefully, they could reshape their future. In early November, East German officials, under mounting pressure, proposed new travel regulations. The intention was to allow controlled, bureaucratic permission for visits to the West. But confusion spread. On November the 9th, 1989, a spokesman for the East German government, Günter Schabowski, held a press conference. When asked when the new travel rules would take effect, he stumbled. As far as I know, immediately. It wasn't planned. It wasn't coordinated. But it was heard. And within hours, Berliners gathered at the checkpoints, thousands, then tens of thousands, at Bornholmer Strasse, at Checkpoint Charlie, at the Brandenburg Gate. The guards, confused, unprepared, overwhelmed, made a choice. They opened the gates, and the wall fell, not with explosives, not with tanks, but with joy, with tears, with hands reaching across a divide once believed to be permanent. The winds of change had become a storm that toppled not only a wall, but an entire world order. And yet, in that storm, there was peace. As East met West, as families reunited, as strangers hugged in the cold Berlin night, one truth became undeniable. No wall, no matter how thick, how tall, how guarded, can stand forever against the steady, stubborn hope of the human spirit. Chapter 7. The Year That Shook the World. For decades, 1984 had been a warning, but it was 1989 that became a revolution. The year began with quiet tension, whispers of reform, flickers of protest, the careful, cautious murmur of a system beginning to lose its grip. But no one, not even the most hopeful, could have predicted how quickly the world would change. Across the Eastern Bloc, cracks widened. In January, Hungarian reformers debated free elections. In February, Poland's solidarity movement, once outlawed, was negotiating with the communist regime. By April, the Polish roundtable talks concluded. Elections would be held, real elections, and solidarity, the movement born in a shipyard and shaped in prisons, would compete. June arrived, and with it, the ballots. Solidarity swept the vote. A non-communist prime minister was appointed, the first in the Eastern Bloc since World War II. The unthinkable had happened, and the Soviet Union did nothing. This was not the 1950s. No tanks rolled in, no armies marched. The domino had fallen, and the hand that once enforced order now hesitated. Hungary watched closely and moved quickly. In May, Hungarian border guards began dismantling the barbed wire fence separating their country from Austria. On August 19th, activists held a symbolic pan-European picnic at the border, a peaceful protest, a public gesture. But when the fence opened, it didn't close. Hundreds of East Germans, vacationing in Hungary, took the opportunity to cross into Austria. A flood of escapees began. By the end of September, thousands had reached the West. It was an open secret, and a visible crack in the wall's illusion of permanence. Back in East Germany, pressure mounted. The GDR celebrated its 40th anniversary in October with pomp and speeches. But outside the staged parades, protesters filled the streets. In Leipzig, over 70,000 people marched. "We are the people," they chanted. It was not rebellion. It was reclamation. The state hesitated. The Stasi watched, but the crackdown never came. Instead, something remarkable happened. The protests grew. Week after week, the Monday demonstrations swelled. Leipzig, Dresden, East Berlin. The silence of decades was replaced with songs, chants, prayers, candlelight parades through grey streets. By November, the government was unraveling. Resignations came swiftly. Honecker, the face of East German rigidity, was gone. Egon Krenz promised reform, but trust had vanished. The people weren't asking for gradual change. They were walking toward it. Then came November 9th. At a press conference, Günter Schabowski read aloud a new travel policy. The details were unclear, But one phrase rang out. When asked when it would take effect, he answered, immediately. The world paused. Crowds gathered. Thousands pressed toward the checkpoints. Confused guards radioed for instructions. No one was sure what to do. And then, one gate opened, then another. The people surged forward. No bullets, no arrests, just cheering, crying, climbing. Berliners climbed onto the wall, danced atop it, hugged across it. Some brought hammers, others brought flowers. All brought disbelief. For 28 years, the wall had stood unbroken. In a single night, it became meaningless. By morning, Berlin was no longer divided, and the world was never the same. Chapter 8. The Night the Wall Fell, November 9th, 1989. It began like any other day. Grey clouds drifted low over Berlin, brushing the rooftops in a silent hush. In the east, radios played the same predictable programs. Children walked to school past the same murals of Lenin and Marx. Trams clicked along cold tracks. State-run newspapers declared the usual successes of the socialist system, even as discontent simmered beneath nearly every conversation. Few people who woke that morning had any inkling that by nightfall, the world they knew would shift forever. It was November the 9th, 1989. By then, East Germany had been under siege, not from bombs, but from ideas, from restlessness, from the relentless flow of truth beyond its borders. In Leipzig, Dresden, and East Berlin, demonstrations had grown bolder by the week. What had started as quiet gatherings in churches had become full-throated calls for reform and freedom. Wir sind das Volk, the people chanted. We are the people. The government, under growing pressure from within and without, had begun to crack. Erich Honecker had resigned. Egon Krenz had taken his place, promising change. But the clock was ticking. And so, on that Thursday afternoon, the East German Politburo met to finalize new travel regulations, a small concession, meant to pacify the public without truly loosening the grip. The idea was to allow East Germans to apply for visas to travel abroad, including to West Germany and West Berlin. It was not an open border. It was not freedom. But the wording was vague, the timing uncertain, the message unclear. At 6:53 p.m., in a now legendary press conference, Politburo spokesman Günter Schabowski sat before a room full of journalists and fumbled the future. A reporter asked, "When do these new travel regulations go into effect?" Schabowski, flipping through a sheaf of papers, glanced down, read a line, and looked up. "As far as I know, immediately." The words hung in the air. No plan, no coordination, no confirmation. And within moments, the world changed. The Associated Press transmitted the news within minutes. West German television aired it by 7 o'clock p.m. Across East Berlin, stunned citizens turned on their televisions and heard the unbelievable. The border was open. Phones began ringing. Neighbors knocked on doors. "Did you hear? Is it true?" Crowds began to form at checkpoints along the wall. At Bornholmer Strasse, a group of East Berliners gathered. Then dozens, then hundreds. Families arrived with coats hastily pulled over pajamas. Teenagers showed up laughing nervously. Old men in grey wool hats clutched trembling passports. No one knew if it was real, but something had shifted, and it pulled people forward. At the gate, border guards stood in confusion. They had received no orders, no memos, just frightened phone calls from headquarters. The West German news was saying the wall was open. The people at the gates believed it, and they were growing louder. "Open the gate!" they chanted. "Wir wollen raus!" "We want out." Guards phoned superiors. Superiors phoned ministries. No one gave clear instructions. No one wanted to be responsible for what might come next. The line between restraint and catastrophe had never been thinner. By 9 p.m, the crowd at Bornholmer Strasse numbered in the thousands. Guards in their green uniforms and steel grey helmets were trapped in a moment they could neither control nor escape. Some were 19-year-olds, some barely older. They held rifles, weapons they were ordered to use in certain situations, but they didn't raise them. Instead, they watched. At 9:20 p.m, the guards relented. They opened the gate. No announcement, no ceremony, just a subtle shift. A few guards stepped aside. The red and white boom barrier lifted, and the people walked through. Some cried, some laughed, some simply stood there, blinking against the bright lights of the West. They stepped into a world they had only heard about in whispers, in forbidden broadcasts, in grainy photographs smuggled across borders. Neon signs glowed, shop windows gleamed, strangers embraced them. The wall had not been breached, it had been bypassed, eclipsed, rendered irrelevant by the sheer will of the people. Word spread fast. Within an hour, all major checkpoints, Checkpoint Charlie, Heinrich-Heine-Straße, Oberbaumbrücke, were overwhelmed. Guards faced the same impossible decision: fire on peaceful citizens or open the gates. One by one, they opened. West Berliners, hearing the news, poured into the streets. They rushed to the wall with bottles of champagne, with boomboxes playing David Bowie and Beethoven. They climbed atop the wall, pulled up East Berliners, and danced. Some held candles, others brought hammers. For the first time in 28 years, Berlin was no longer divided. Television crews captured it all. The world watched, breath held, as one of the Cold War's most immovable symbols crumbled in real time. Not with explosives or diplomacy, but with joy. At the Brandenburg Gate, the image became iconic. Young people from both sides stood atop the wall, arm in arm. Police, both east and west, stood back. There was no violence, no retaliation, just celebration. By midnight, the wall was covered in people. Graffiti artists tagged it. Musicians played violins and guitars on its ledges. Couples kissed beneath its floodlights. Children were lifted onto their parents' shoulders to see history being made. And all across East Berlin, an eerie silence settled. Those who hadn't gone to the border stood in kitchens, watching Western news broadcasts for the first time. Listening, hoping. Some wept alone. Some called relatives they hadn't spoken to in decades. And in homes across West Berlin, once separated families prepared for reunions long thought impossible. In the early hours of November 10th, the first chunks of concrete were chipped away, not by machines, but by hand. Hammers, screwdrivers, crowbars. The Mauerspechter, wallpeckers, chipped away at the hated barrier, collecting pieces as souvenirs. They worked all night and through the morning. By noon the next day, entire segments had been reduced to rubble. The symbolism could not be overstated. For decades, the Berlin Wall had represented oppression, division, and the futility of rebellion. In a single night, it became a canvas for joy, for reunification, for proof that the past could be undone. But beneath the euphoria, deeper emotions stirred. Grief for the years lost, for the lives taken, for the dreams denied. Fear of what would come next, of what it meant to be free after so long in chains. Wonder that such a thing could truly, actually happen. In the days that followed, the wall was dismantled piece by piece. Bulldozers replaced hammers. Construction crews arrived. Roadways reopened. Trams reconnected. Families, long separated, embraced. Church bells rang, flags flew, and across Germany a single word echoed: Wiedervereinigung, reunification. It would take time, months of negotiation, years of healing, but the wall, both physical and psychological, was broken, and Berlin was whole again. Chapter 9: Voices of Reunification. Hope, doubt, and celebration. The wall was gone, but the shadow remained. In the days and weeks following that night in November 1989, Berlin became a city of reunions. Train stations turned into places of embrace. Airports were flooded with emotion. Streets that had once ended abruptly at concrete barriers now flowed into one another, like blood rushing back to a long-numbed limb. But reunification was not just a matter of geography. It was personal, psychological, emotional. For every hug shared between long-separated siblings, there was also a quiet pause, an awkward silence. Nearly 3 decades had passed. People had changed. Cities had changed. Beliefs, customs, even language had evolved in different directions. West Germans had grown up with choice, advertising, travel, pop culture, capitalism. East Germans, Ossis, as they came to be called, had lived in a world of structure and scarcity, surveillance and control. Their experience of the world was different, their expectations more cautious, their identity more layered. When they met again, cousins, friends, parents and children, it was often joyful, but it was never simple. Some East Germans stepped into the West and felt wonder. Supermarkets with towering shelves, bright neon signs, Levi's, bananas, magazines, the mundane, suddenly magical. But for others, it was overwhelming, loud, fast, disorienting. The reunification of Germany became official on October the 3rd, 1990. The two halves of the country, divided since the end of World War II, became one sovereign state. The black, red, and gold flag was raised across the nation. The capital was declared Berlin. But behind the ceremony lay deeper questions. What does it mean to become one country again after living as strangers? In workplaces, East Germans were often dismissed as behind the times. Their qualifications, earned under a socialist system, were sometimes invalidated. Factories shut down. State-owned enterprises collapsed. Unemployment surged. The West had the capital, the infrastructure, the global connections. The East had the people, resilient, resourceful, but suddenly adrift. Some felt liberated, others humiliated. Western politicians spoke of a blühende Landschaften, blooming landscapes, in the East. And while there were investments, rebuilding and renewal, the gap remained. Voices emerged from both sides. A former East German teacher said, "I crossed the border and saw all the shops, but no one greeted me. In the East, we had little, but we had each other." A West German businessman replied, "We gave up our taxes, our time, our systems to help reunify, but they call us arrogant. They resent us." Berlin itself became the symbol of this complex unity. In Mitte, new construction blossomed. Cranes dotted the skyline. Government buildings were renovated. Museums reopened. But elsewhere, in Lichtenberg, Marzahn, and Köpenick, the changes came slower. Graffiti still marked the old wall's path. Memorials rose in quiet corners. Brass plates with the names of those who had died trying to cross. Photos, flowers. And among the younger generation, a new identity formed. One not defined solely by East or West, but by a shared past and a shared future. Art played a role. Painters, filmmakers, musicians. They explored the themes of memory, loss, and hope. The Berlin art scene exploded, drawing creatives from around the world. The wall, once a symbol of oppression, now became a canvas, both literally and metaphorically, for reconciliation. Tourists came in droves. They walked the East Side Gallery, a stretch of the wall preserved and covered in murals. They visited Checkpoint Charlie. They posed for photos, smiling where soldiers once aimed rifles. And all the while, Berlin evolved. It became a city of dualities, past and present, memory and reinvention. A place where techno pulsed in repurposed bunkers and history whispered from cobblestones. For some, the reunification was redemption. For others, a kind of erasure. But over time, the voices began to harmonize through conversation, through policy, through art, through simple human connection. And though the road was uneven, it led forward. One voice among many, a woman in her 70s, born in the East, said it best. "We were two cities once, two countries, two minds. But we never stopped dreaming of the day we'd walk the same streets again. Now we do. And even with all the noise, the pain, the questions, that's still something beautiful." Chapter 10. Legacy of the Wall, Memory, Meaning, and a Unified Germany. The Berlin Wall no longer stands. The concrete is gone. The barbed wire has vanished. The floodlights are dark. The watchtowers empty. The dogs no longer patrol. The armed guards no longer glare across a border that divided not just a city, but an idea. And yet, in many ways, the wall remains. Not in the bricks, but in memory. Not in its height, but in its depth. Not in the silence it once enforced, but in the echoes it left behind. Berlin is whole again. Germany reunited. But the story of the wall, the why, the how, the what it meant, is far from over. It lives in museums and memorials, in art and architecture, in the stories whispered from one generation to the next, in the subtle gestures of people who still remember which side they were born on and what that meant. To understand the legacy of the wall is not simply to revisit the past. It is to walk through a mirror of human nature, to see how fear can build barriers and how hope can break them down. Let us walk together now, not along the wall, but through the shadow it cast, and the light that followed. The aftermath, picking up the pieces. When the wall came down, there were celebrations, yes. Champagne on the streets, embraces at the checkpoints, fireworks over the Brandenburg Gate. But after the celebration came the reckoning. Reunification was not just a political act. It was an emotional earthquake. Lives had diverged for 28 years. Systems, schools, values, and cultures had grown apart. There were jobs that no longer existed, currencies that no longer held value, identities that no longer made sense. For many in the former East Germany, the Ossis, the fall of the wall felt like both liberation and loss. Their world had vanished overnight. Some adapted quickly, others struggled. Pensions evaporated, homes were repossessed, careers, once stable, dissolved into unemployment. Factories closed, shops emptied. Cities that had once been proud socialist showcases became economic ghost towns. And in the West, the Westies, the challenge was different. They were asked to absorb, to adapt, to pay. Taxes rose to fund reunification. Public programs shifted. Entire institutions were reorganized. And some West Germans, used to viewing the East as the other side, now found themselves face to face with people they'd been taught to pity or ignore. Integration was not easy, but it was happening, piece by piece, policy by policy, story by story. The personal wall, healing invisible divides. Long after the physical wall fell, invisible walls remained. They lived in dialects, the way someone from the East said certain words that marked them instantly. They lived in resumes, East German qualifications often deemed untranslatable in the West. They lived in family dinners, where older relatives still defended the good parts of the GDR, and younger ones asked, "How could you not see?" They lived in music, fashion, habits, and history. Even decades later, surveys would show that people from East and West still held differing views on democracy, economics, and trust in institutions. Not out of hostility, but out of experience. The fall of the wall didn't erase the past. It revealed it, in full color, in messy, complicated, very human ways. Yet it also allowed for something else, conversation. For the first time, East Germans could share their stories freely, their pain, their pride, their memories, their contradictions. And West Germans could listen, not as saviors or victors, but as fellow citizens. It was, and still is, a long conversation. The wall in the world, a global symbol. The Berlin Wall came to symbolize far more than a Cold War division. It became the ultimate metaphor for separation between nations, between ideologies, between people. And so, when it fell, the world watched not just in political interest, but in personal reflection. Could other walls fall? Could other nations reunite? Could old enemies find common ground? Fragments of the wall now stand in dozens of countries around the world. In schools, in city squares, in art galleries and airports. Each one is more than a historical artifact. It's a question posed in concrete. What walls have we built, and what will it take to bring them down? Berlin. Today, a living city of memory. Berlin is no longer the divided city it once was. But it has not buried the past. It has woven it into its fabric. Walk through Berlin today, and you walk through a living museum. There's the East Side Gallery, a mile-long stretch of the wall now covered in murals, each painting a testament to freedom, defiance, and dreams realized. There's the Berlin Wall Memorial on Bernauer Straße, with preserved sections of the wall, the death strip, and the watchtowers, untouched, raw, real. There's the topography of terror, built on the former site of the Gestapo headquarters, documenting the machinery of oppression. And there's the memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe, an undulating field of grey concrete blocks. Abstract, silent, overwhelming. Berlin does not hide from history. It confronts it, lives with it, learns from it. And in doing so, it teaches the human stories, remembering the names. The wall was not just a political barrier, it was a human tragedy. Over 140 people died trying to cross it. Some were shot, some drowned, some fell. Some bled to death as guards looked on. Each had a name, a face, a story. Peter Fechter, 18 years old, was shot and left to die at the foot of the wall in 1962. His screams echoed for nearly an hour as no one intervened. Chris Geffroy, 20 years old, was killed just 9 months before the wall fell. The last person to die trying to escape. Each year, vigils are held, flowers laid, silence observed. Because memory is not passive, it is an act of respect, a promise that what happened will not be forgotten and must not be repeated. The future, walls that still stand. The fall of the Berlin Wall did not end all walls. Others still stand, in concrete and steel, in ideology and fear. Some are along borders, others live in hearts. But the lesson of Berlin is clear. Walls are never permanent. They may last years, decades, even generations, but they fall. They fall when people speak, when they walk together, when they choose courage over comfort, dialogue over division. They fall when someone makes the first move, to step across, to listen, to dream. And even when they do not fall, they crack, they weaken, they begin to forget why they were ever built. Drifting to peace, what the wall left behind. As we end this journey, this long, slow walk through time, we are left with more than history. We are left with perspective, a reminder of what it means to be free, what it takes to protect that freedom, and how fragile it can be when left undefended. But also, how resilient we are, how deeply people long to connect, how powerfully a single night, a single mistake at a press conference can open a gate and let the future flood in. So as you drift into rest, let the images settle, the shouts of protest, the clatter of chisels, the flash of a passport in a trembling hand, the cold steel of a checkpoint giving way to cheers. Let it all wash over you, because these were real people, real lives, real moments of decision and doubt, hope and heartbreak. And they remind us that even the darkest chapters can end, even the tallest walls can fall.
Even the most divided cities can become whole again.
And that sometimes the most powerful revolutions don't begin with gunfire,
But with footsteps.